There is a town in America with its own zip code, its own government, its own tavern, and its own library. It has streetlights, a mayor, a treasurer, and a voter registration roll. And when the sun goes down, every one of those institutions belongs to a single 92-year-old woman named Elsie Eiler, because she is the only person who lives there. The town is called Monowai. Population 1. Not one family. Not one household. One person. Drive north through Boyd County, Nebraska, past miles of cornfields and grazing cattle, and eventually the GPS insists you've arrived somewhere. What you find instead is a scattering of collapsed buildings, a church with tires stacked in its pews, a grain elevator rusting against the sky, and a single lit sign that reads, Monowai Tavern. Everything else is silence. By the time the tavern closes for the night, there is no other light for miles. No second car in a driveway. No dog barking from a neighbor's yard, because there is no neighbor. Just 3 street lamps, paid for out of one woman's pocket, glowing over empty lots where a town of 150 people used to live. To understand how a town becomes this, how an entire municipality can shrink down to a single human being who still, every year, wins her own mayoral election, you have to go back to when Monowai was alive. In 1902, the Fremont, Elkhorn and Missouri Valley Railroad pushed its line through the empty grassland of northern Nebraska, and towns sprang up along the tracks the way they always did in that era. Fast, hopeful, and entirely dependent on the trains that fed them. Monowai was one of them, named, according to local tradition, for the wild flowers that grew along the railbed. Whether or not the name is truly a Native American word for flower, the story stuck, and so did the town. By the 1930s, Monowai was not a footnote. It was a functioning American community. Roughly 150 people called it home. There were grocery stores, restaurants, church, jail, school. Cattle ranchers rode in from the surrounding farms to sell livestock, stock up on supplies, and catch the daily train, nicknamed the winter motor, that connected the town to the wider world. For a place this small, it had everything a family could need. Among the children growing up in that town were 2 kids who would later marry. A boy named Rudy Eiler, and a girl named Elsie. They met as children, in a town that still had a future. That future did not last. What happened to Monowai is what happened to hundreds of small towns across the Great Plains in the 20th century. And the tragedy of it is exactly how ordinary it was. Farming mechanized. Fewer hands were needed to work the same amount of land. The railroad, once the lifeblood of the town, gradually lost its purpose as trucking and highways took over freight. Young people, faced with dwindling opportunity, left for cities, and they did not come back. At first, the decline would have looked survivable. Family moves away. Storefront closes. A for sale sign goes up and stays up a little too long. None of it feels catastrophic in the moment. That is how these things work. A town does not die all at once. Leaks. By the time Rudy and Elsie were adults, they had already made their choice. In the 1970s, the couple bought the local tavern, the one surviving business left in town, and Elsie took on the roles of town secretary and treasurer. They weren't naive about what was happening around them. They watched their neighbors leave, one household at a time, and they stayed anyway. By the year 2000, the U.S. Census recorded something almost unbelievable. Monowai's population had fallen to exactly 2. Rudy and Elsie Eiler. Husband and wife. The entire town. They kept running the tavern. They kept the town incorporated, which meant filing paperwork, holding elections, and meeting the state's legal requirements year after year. An enormous, almost absurd amount of bureaucracy for a population that could fit at one kitchen table. But letting the incorporation lapse would have meant Monowai ceased to legally exist. So they filed. Every year. Then, in 2004, Rudy died. And Monowai's population dropped from 2 to 1. This is the moment the story usually gets told wrong. It's easy to imagine what came next as a fade to black. A woman alone in a dying town, the last light going out. But that's not what happened. Elsie stayed. Not out of stubbornness, and not because she had nowhere else to go. Her children live as far away as Arizona and the Netherlands, and she could have joined them. She stayed because Monowai was hers, and because leaving would have meant something ending that she wasn't ready to let end. She kept the tavern open. She kept the books. And in her husband's memory, she built something new. A library housed in a 320-square-foot shed, filled with the roughly 5,000 books Rudy had spent his life collecting. Anyone who visits can borrow one on the honor system. There's no librarian checking names, because the librarian is also the only patron for miles. Under Nebraska law, an incorporated town needs a functioning government to remain a town. So Elsie became that government. She is the mayor. She is the clerk. She is the treasurer. She is the entire town council. And since she is also the only registered voter, she wins every election by a mathematically perfect landslide. Every cycle, she still puts up a hand-lettered vote for Elsie sign, because doing it properly matters to her, even when the outcome was never in doubt. The paperwork does not stop there. As mayor, she signs her own liquor license. As treasurer, she collects roughly $500 a year in taxes from herself to keep the town's 3 streetlights burning and the water running. As clerk, she files an annual municipal road plan with the state for roads that lead to a population of exactly 1 in order to keep receiving state funding. If she ever stopped filing that paperwork, Monowai would cease to be a town. It would become, officially and permanently, nothing. That is the quiet tension sitting underneath every year Elsie keeps this going. The survival of an entire incorporated municipality depends entirely on one woman's willingness to keep doing the paperwork. In 2010, the census confirmed what everyone already suspected. Monowai was, and remains, the only incorporated place in the United States with a population of exactly 1. It even earned a footnote in the Guinness World Records as the smallest incorporated town on Earth. Then, in 2021, something happened that genuinely startled her. The Census Bureau's new count listed Monowai's population as 2. For a moment this looked impossible. Elsie knew, better than anyone alive, exactly how many people lived in her town. She joked that someone must be hiding in her house, since there was nowhere else to live. The real explanation was stranger in its own way than any ghost story. The Census Bureau had begun applying a statistical technique called differential privacy, deliberately injecting small amounts of noise into their data to prevent any single individual from being identifiable in extremely small populations. An algorithm designed to protect anonymity had briefly conjured a phantom second resident out of thin air. When the method was explained, the record was corrected. Population 1. Just Elsie, exactly as it had been since 2004. Today, at 92 years old, Elsie still opens the Monowai Tavern 6 days a week. She serves burgers, hot dogs, and cold beer to hunters, bikers, curious travelers, and regulars who drive in from towns that still have more than 1 resident. On a good day, dozens of strangers pass through, drawn by a population. One road sign that has become, unintentionally, one of the most photographed pieces of roadside Americana in the country. She works roughly 12 hours a day behind that bar by herself, because there is no one else to share the shift with. And when the last customer leaves and she locks the tavern door, something happens that most visitors never stay long enough to witness. The town doesn't just get quiet. Disappears. There is no glow of a second porch light. No hum of another television down the block. No sound of another car pulling out of another driveway. Just 3 street lamps, an empty church with tires in its pews, a rusting grain elevator standing black against the stars, and one house with 1 person inside it, in the middle of a town that technically, legally, still exists. It's not that Monowai has a reputation for being haunted, or dangerous, or forbidden after dark. It's something quieter and in its own way, harder to sit with. After dark, Monowai becomes the closest thing America has to a town that has already ended, except for the single stubborn fact that it hasn't. Elsie has said, in interviews over the years, that she doesn't experience this as loneliness. The tavern, she's noted, still feels like one big extended family, just one that reassembles itself every day out of strangers and regulars passing through. But even she has acknowledged the obvious, unanswered question hovering over Monowai's future. What happens when she can no longer file the paperwork? What happens when there's no one left to sign the liquor license, collect the taxes, or campaign, however symbolically, For her own re-election. There is no ambiguity about the answer. Nebraska law is clear. Without a functioning government, incorporation lapses. The 3 streetlights would eventually go dark for good, not because anyone shut them off, but because no one would be left to pay for them. The library's 5,000 books, gathered by a man who has been dead for over 2 decades, would sit on their shelves with no one left to lend them out. Monowai would join the list of true ghost towns scattered across the Great Plains, the ones with no name on a census form at all, just foundations in the grass and a historical marker if you're lucky. This is the part of the story that separates Monowai from a simple curiosity. It's not really a story about a strange census statistic, or a novelty sign on a Nebraska highway. It's a story about what an entire American landscape looks like when it empties out, and about one woman's decision, made quietly and repeatedly for over 20 years, to keep signing the paperwork that says a place still matters, even after almost everyone who ever lived there is gone. The deeper you look at what happened to towns like Monowai, the less it reads like an isolated anomaly, and the more it reads like a preview. Rural depopulation across the Great Plains didn't happen because of one bad decade or one collapsed industry. It happened because of decades of quiet, compounding decisions. Mechanized farming that needed fewer workers, consolidated school districts that pulled families toward bigger towns, highway systems that bypassed small rail stops, and successive generations who left for opportunity and simply never had a reason to come back. Monowai isn't an accident of history. It's the mathematical endpoint of a trend line that a lot of small towns are still somewhere in the middle of. What makes Monowai different isn't that it emptied out. Plenty of places did. What makes it different is that one person refused to let the emptying become an ending. Every filed tax form, every liquor license, every hand-painted campaign sign for an election she cannot lose, is a small act of insistence. This still counts as a town because I say it does, and the law happens to agree with me. Elsie Eiler did not set out to become a symbol. She set out to keep a tavern open and a library standing in her husband's memory. But somewhere along the way, in the middle of the Nebraska prairie, she became something closer to a living argument. Proof that a place can hollow out almost entirely and still, technically, legally, stubbornly remain a place as long as one person is willing to keep showing up. Someday, inevitably, the paperwork will stop. The lights will go dark for the last time, and Monowai will quietly cross over from population 1 to population 0, joining the hundreds of other Nebraska ghost towns that no longer even have a name on a map. But for now, if you drive north through Boyd County after the sun goes down, there is still one light on. One person behind one bar in one town that the rest of America forgot to finish erasing.